look at FMX and I see hundreds of talented people and rocket science, it's like high-level technology, with the digital era. And all of this was spawned from Star Wars. Star Wars was the one that basically many of these people saw and they said, that's what I want to do with my life. My name is Richard Edlund, and I'm a visual effects supervisor and a cinematographer, basically. And I've done a lot of movies. The early movies: Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Return of the Jedi, Poltergeist, Ghostbusters, Die Hard, Cliffhanger, Batman Returns, Multiplicity, and Air Force One. I started in photography in high school, and I had a really great teacher who was physics. He taught physics and photography, so I learned the physics of photography, and so that gave me a very good basis. I then joined the Navy and went to the Naval Photographic School and studied everything from aerial photography to kind of was light on movies. But then when I was then stationed in Japan for 2 years at the photo lab that had every kind of photographic equipment, and I found a 16 millimeter Mitchell camera that someone had ordered and had not, and they got shipped out, and so it hadn't even been opened. And so I basically got interested in movies, found a very good book on the silent film in the library, the only one book they had on movies. And we didn't have any sound equipment, so the silent book was useful. And I started shooting training films using subtitles and James Wong Howe type low angle shots, and it was I got interested in movies then. When I got out of the service, I went to USC, the University of Southern California, cinema school for a couple of years, and then I decided that I was going to try to get a job in Hollywood, and I put a resume into the Department of Employment, which I didn't know anybody in Hollywood at that time. So, and a man who had a company that did opticals and titles and inserts for mostly television commercials and television, but some feature work. He found my resume and called me up, and I went to visit him, and about 25 minutes into the interview, he hired me. And so I then got a chance to work with some of the great cinematographers. One was James Wong Howe, who shot many, he was a famous cinematographer, and Ernie Haller was my favorite. He shot Gone with the Wind, and so I was able to learn cinematographers' tricks from these people, and we did special effects for movies too. So I was the crew. In other words, when they came in, I was the gaffer, the grip, I ran the film to the lab. I was everything, and we even did an animation job on the first stainless steel blades. And this was in '63 or '4 or '5, somewhere in there. It was, and with the marching blades, and these razor blades were marching down the street, about 50 of them, and so I learned how to do stop motion animation. And so I became a hippie photographer for a while, doing rock and roll album covers and things like that. And when I got out of that, I started shooting early motion control using Western Union teletype keyboard and punch tape to control the camera, and so about 2 years of that, and I wound up getting a call from John Dykstra and Gary Kurtz and George Lucas to potentially be the head photographer on Star Wars, the first one. We actually resurrected VistaVision for Star Wars, and when we were doing Star Wars in VistaVision, Doug Trumbull was working on Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 65 millimeter, and those. I think we made the best choice for models because for our style of doing the work, the VistaVision was the camera, the film went sideways through the camera, so the bottom of the camera was close, and so it was the center of the lens was only this far from the bottom of the camera, so we could get very close to the models, and we could work with small models, and we had many shots, and many more shots than we were in Close Encounters. And so VistaVision, the reason we chose that is it's double width. The frame is double the size of normal 35. It's actually a little more than double. And so basically what we do is we'd shoot an image that's this wide, and then when we composite it, we composite it to 35 millimeter anamorphic. And so basically we start with a large format and reduce it in composite, and by reducing in composite we avoid what used to be the doopy look, because usually when you dupe 35 to another 35, there's a little kind of milkiness to the image, and that wasn't the case with VistaVision. So it was a very good choice from our standpoint. The main camera was kind of a weird movement. It wasn't very good movement, but in other words, it wasn't steady, and I had to shoot a lot of the shots in reverse. It was steady in reverse, but not forward. So all these travails, we had to work our way out of it. We had to invent our way out of problems all the time, and we had a much lesser budget on Star Wars. I mean, the entire visual effects budget for Star Wars, I think, was something like $2.5 million, and we worked for over 2 years on the project, and there was about 50, maybe 50 people was the crew. And we had 365 shots approximately to do, and we had a locked in. It had to be done by a certain date. So everything, all the pressure was built into it. But it was a great period of invention, and it was a lot of fun. It's kind of a split between Raiders of the Lost Ark and Poltergeist. Star Wars was a fantasy, so you could really cheat a lot and get away with things because it was a fantastic situation. Raiders was sort of a fantasy, but it was taking place in a recognizable period, but Poltergeist was really a difficult project, and it because it had like the imploding house, the house that sucks down into a burning light. To do that was, exploding is easy, imploding is much different. So there were many challenges in Poltergeist, and not only that, but it was taking place, and it was not only not a fantasy, but it was happening in the house next door. This was the. And so what do ghosts look like? So we had to come up with these solutions. I made a deal with Doug Trumbull to take over the studio. He said that he wanted to get out of visual effects, which didn't happen. But anyway, I took over the equipment that had been amassed during the Star Trek and Blade Runner era. However, my style of visual effects is entirely different than Douglas, and I use a lot of blue screen and traveling matte work, which he didn't get into at all practically. I used rear projection and matte paintings and miniatures and whatever, but so I had to rebuild the studio. And when I started, by the time the lawyers got done with me on Ghostbusters, which took a couple of months, kind of, in my opinion, wasted time. We had 10 months left to rebuild the studio, and I called everybody, and I took a lot of people out of ILM that I had brought there, and they all left and came to work with me at Boss. And so we had to rebuild the studio, including lenses. We were building lenses from scratch, and for the optical printer and motion control equipment, and we built a reflex 65 millimeter camera, which there wasn't one at the time that would work for us. That wasn't a pellicle. It's another technical issue, but this was a spinning mirror reflex like the Aeroflex, except it was 65 millimeter. And so we built one of those as well. So it was, and then we had to do like about 200 shots or more, and again make the July 8th release date. First, it was all 65. All the movies were done in 65, and that is the plate photography and everything was shot in 65. When we did Batman, that was several years later. I mean, we started using VistaVision as well, and so we had 65 and VistaVision. And then when we did, there was a movie called Multiplicity, which was digitally. We shot anamorphic with a regular Panavision camera, and so because when in the digital world, you're scanning you're scanning and recording on film, but there's no you don't have the generation loss with digital that you experience with the photochemical process. So basically, we used all the formats. We were bidding against ILM on projects, and also DreamQuest came into the picture, and Apogee. So there were basically 4 companies that did good visual effects at the time, and so we were bidding against them. As time went on, the seed had been planted and more companies grew, and so we started getting more competition from areas that we never figured that were going to be there. When I started out working on Star Wars, I went out and met with a few of the old masters that had done visual effects on movies back in the 50s and 40s even. Because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel when I didn't have to. I mean, in other words, if I could get some information about how to do this or that, that was helpful. But again, on Star Wars, we had to rebuild this. We had to build the studio. I mean, I started on Star Wars. There was this huge room with a card table and a phone on it. And I had a friend at Paramount that had the optical printer that was last used on the Ten Commandments, and I purchased the optical printer and 2 rotoscope benches with mirrors, big units, with the 24-inch field animation. So it was we could do pretty high quality animation in that size. And 2 or 3 Bell & Howell cameras that had been modified for VistaVision. So got an incredible amount of equipment from Howard for practically no money. But these again, they had to be rebuilt and electronics to drive them. You know, they were in the era where it was gears and you know, DC or AC motors and gears to run the equipment. Actually, the first project that I did digitally was Ghost, and I'm trying to remember, that was in, I think it was '89, and basically Jerry Zucker, the director of the project, we had bid on it, but ILM got that show from us, and they were getting down towards the time when they had to have a screening of the movie, and they had forgot to do the end sequence, and then they only had a few weeks, and they only had a shot. The shot at the end of that movie is basically Patrick Swayze is walking into heaven, and he's surrounded by these kind of angelic figures, and but all they had at that time was Patrick Swayze walking up a Mylar ramp towards a blue screen, and there were actually grips in the scene that would be later garbage matted out, as we called it. And so this was like the scene that the audience was going to leave the theater after having seen, and they had Unchained Melody, this fantastic song playing, and they didn't have any idea that Ghost was going to be a box office success, which it was. So I talked Howard Koch, who came in to save the movie, actually, into doing the end sequence in video, because actually the digital technology first came into commercials because there was far less data to deal with. I mean, the data that you had to deal with for big screen projection was much different than television, and so I talked him into doing it in digital video, and I had a few people that were really smart electronic people to convert the digital video to film, and basically up-res it. So we went from 540 to double that, you know, by up-resing. And I did a test of the whole end sequence, and it took about less than 2 weeks to do that. And it went out to film, and they had a screening for the executives at Paramount, and they thought it was great, and they thought these were finals, but they were done from work print. You know, so I had, and the beauty of this was to do this whole sequence in digital video off of work print and to get it done quickly for the screening was, in a sense, throwing that money away, because I had to do it again with proper coming off of interpositives and VistaVision material. But in fact, it wasn't wasted, because we were able to find out where Jerry wanted to go with the sequence creatively, and so we solved all the creative issues in this time. And so basically, to do it finally again with digital video was. It went much quicker than it would have. So, and that was like the first significant digital project we did, and then we got a commercial called Budweiser does these Bud Bowl commercials where there's 5 commercials, and they're very expensive commercials, and they only run them once at Super Bowl. And so we got this. We had done Super Bowl III, and then we got into Super Bowl III was done with stop motion, but Super Bowl VI was digital animation, and in order to do that, I had to buy, like 6 or 7 or 8 workstations, Silicon Graphics workstations, which were very expensive, but the commercial paid for them. And that's kind of how we got started, and then it started growing from there. in the photochemical era, getting rid of a matte line was a really significant problem. I mean, to conquer the matte line, and we did that on Empire Strikes Back with special optics that I had made. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars to build this printer, optical printer, with all the lenses were like great big lenses like this, but they were like 20 element lenses. They're very slick and very high resolution lenses that were built for it to get rid of the matte line. But in the digital era, I found I could be much bolder in terms of how I approached anything, because it was possible to do things, and software was appearing that made it possible. I mean, morphing, for example, we were after that for years, and finally that became available, and pretty soon you could go to the street, you could go to the computer shop and buy that program. So I guess, I mean, the digital era not only made it possible to do things, I hate to say easier, but it also made it possible to do things that we didn't even think about doing in the photochemical time. I mean, when we get further into the digital world, when you start dealing with hair and water and these kinds of really highly technological issues, creative issues. I mean, that was not possible in the photochemical era. And I actually was getting frustrated because as I mentioned earlier, because in the television, we had a television commercial division, and I could go into a digital compositing bay with a commercial shot that was not right, it was not working, and fix it, and come out with a great shot, you know, with the digital tools that were available, but that was not available for film so much. I mean, until Ghost, as I mentioned. The digital world opened up infinite possibilities. I mean, the reason that visual effects can be done at all is because the camera takes 24 still pictures a second. And so therefore it breaks time down into 24 images per second. And then you can work on each one of those images. And in the photochemical area, you had rotoscoping, and you had miniatures and high-speed photography and various techniques, various technologies that you could use. But with the digital world, there were infinite possibilities, and basically things that we wouldn't even think of attempting. We could jump right in and do things. And so basically, the frustration that I was feeling with the photochemical process was lifted, and all of a sudden we got into the digital world, which was of course extremely expensive, and I mean, I can't imagine the cost of the early digital equipment. I mean, there was a stack of hard drives that was about this high for 9 gigabytes. It was $30,000, and we had to have 20 of them. So I mean, writing those big checks was painful, you know, because everybody thought, where's all this money going? You know, I mean, the studio. I mean, they don't mind making huge amounts of money at the box office, but they don't want to spend anything to make the movie to generate those profits. So it's always difficult, you know, because the studios are very good at negotiating, and they have gotten real good at it over the 100 or so years they've been in business. Another one that was really tough but great fun was Multiplicity, where Michael Keaton was playing 4 parts, and he was interacting with himself, and he was able to walk around the room, and we had a very complicated set of playback equipment, and so that we could shoot one pass, motion control with camera move and everything, and then the stand-in would be in the shot with a TV camera shooting Michael's performance, then the next performance, the footage that was shot by the stand-in would be playing on a monitor that would be in sync with the first performance, so that his next performance, he could look at the monitor, which is where his head was, and so he's looking exactly at himself, and he's reacting to his own dialogue. And he had like an earphone and a complex way of hiding the earphone, so he could hear himself, and so the timing of it was, because it was sort of a comedy, and Harold Ramis was the director. Michael Keaton played the parts, and when he got into 3 and 4 characters in the scene at the same time, this would not have been possible in the old photochemical era. And then he'd sit down on the couch, and the couch would bend, and then his next character would be sitting next to him, and so we had elastic reality to fix problems with the furniture, and so that was a really difficult project. But at the same time, it was. I used to say, if I ever do a movie where I'm really satisfied with every shot, I think I'm ready to retire. But this was long before I retired. I mean, but the thing is, that was the way I felt at the end of the show, that it was really perfect, and we couldn't have made it any better. Well, I love digital projection. I mean, first of all, film projection is like 19th century technology. I mean, it's really old-fashioned, and it has certain problems, such as strobing. When the camera moves too fast, it jitters. Because each frame that you see of the 24 is projected twice, so you're basically seeing 48 flickers per second, which is the flicker threshold. If it flickers less than that, it'll flicker. So it'll appear to flicker, and so with digital projection, it doesn't flicker. It judders. If somebody moves too fast, then they judder. But that's much less of a problem than flicker, because like Samsung came up with this really nice smoothing program that runs in real time, so it actually smooths out the judder. And besides the other I mean, there's many problems with digital with film projection. I mean, the unsteadiness of the projector, sometimes it jitters, and it weaves back and forth, and not only that, but if you go to see a movie that's been in the theater already for 2 weeks, the print is starting to fade because you're pumping enormous amounts of light through this film, and it fades. It causes the fade, and also by that time it's going to have scratches and dirt and all these other problems. So digital projection is wonderful, and one of my best experiences of late was, and it was about a couple of years ago actually, there was a screening of Empire Strikes Back at USC, at the school, and it was a 4K reconstruction of Empire Strikes Back. So the entire negative had been scanned at 4K, and then cleaned up, any dust or any of that kind of stuff was removed. So the movie looked like it was all original photography. It wasn't the dupe. It was not a dupe. It looked like original negative print, and it was magnificent. And you would not be able to see it in the old days in that form. If the photochemical print was, if everything was absolutely perfect, which it usually isn't, then we might have a little bit of an argument there. But because the digital print is not going to be a dupe, which the 70 millimeter print is, that's the argument that might win, because it's not a dupe. It's a digital dupe, which doesn't cause image degradation. And further, I think that, I mean, even though digital projection now, most of the theaters have 2K projectors, and a few have 4K projectors. However, last year only one movie was finished in 4K in Hollywood, because it's very expensive. So they try to get away with, 2K release, and so in the future, I believe that laser projection is the answer, and for that reason, I mean, laser projection will give you higher dynamic range. In other words, you get more steps of gray in the toe, and it doesn't burn out so fast up on the top. So I mean, you have this bell curve of the image is in a bell curve. So the highlights are up here on the top, and then the straight line portion is the middle tones, and then the toe is the shadows in the dark areas. With digital projection, you don't suffer. I mean, you can counteract what you suffered with the photochemical process with software, and I've seen incredible shadow detail in laser projection that I haven't seen anywhere else. So the laser projection is what we will find in the future. So IMAX is switching to digital, yes, and I know that Christopher Nolan and a couple of other sort of diehards who only want to shoot on film, including JJ, and the latest Star Wars was shot on film, and that was because they wanted the latest Star Wars to look like the original, and have some qualities of the original photography of the original Star Wars. But I think that as we get more sophisticated, you'll be able to duplicate the film look by adding grain if you want, and I think that the Curious Case of Benjamin Button was a really fantastic example of that, because the movie was shot with a relatively noisy digital camera. Mostly, it was shot mostly with a camera called the Viper, which was a little on the noisy side. And I saw some of the before and after material that had gone through a process called the Lowry process. John Lowry was an algorithm genius, and he came up with a process that converted noisy 2/3-inch digital material into something that looked like maybe it was a 65 or a 70 millimeter print. And basically the way that process worked was that they first sharpened it and the technique was that it looked forward at 10 frames in front and 10 frames behind, and the computer would dither and decide automatically what should be there and what shouldn't be there. So they could basically increase the resolution of the image by that technique. So 95% of the material would go through this process automatically. It required an enormous data number crunching computer power. And so it wasn't cheap to do that. It was several $100,000 to do the movie that way, but it really made that movie look magnificent. All these modern techniques, keep getting better and better, and visual effects has drawn into its bosom these brilliant engineers and scientists who continue to come up with ways to increase the viewing quality of the movie business. I love movies. I have not seen much lately. I need to go see Jungle Book. That's the current hot ticket. I don't think I'll ever retire. I mean, I think I'm actually working on developing a project that I've owned for a long time. It's a science fiction novel called The Forever War, and I've set that up at Warner Brothers with Channing Tatum to star. So I'm into the producing business now. So that, and The Forever War, I think Warner's is excited about it because it's another franchise. The title, like The Forever War, it's a love story that takes place in future. But I don't want to do a 2,000 shot heart attack movie again. You know, I've been there and done that.